we disagree about?
Well,
mustaches versus beards. Butter side up. No, down.
I think we're about to start. It's definitely been 10 seconds. We might be live right now. I'm unsure. Just getting the go ahead from Mike.
If you're seeing us, you get to see how the magic is made.
We'll pretend that we're stills.
You know what? Let me just check here. All right, you guys are live. You guys have been live. Go for it.
Amazing. Well, thanks for watching this pregame, everybody. My name's Scott Meyer. I am the VP of Learning at MetaCrafters, where we're teaching Web 2 devs become Web 3 devs. I'm also the author and podcast host of ed3.gg, where we talk about how to scale education. I'm here with a good friend of mine, a mentor, someone who's helped connect me in this space, one of the OGs. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're working on, Greg?
Hey, Scott, and hey, Reedy there in the shadows. Greg Nadeau here. I'm with Public Consulting Group and do a bunch of technical standards work with Scott and with other folks. So happy to be here.
It's amazing. So Greg and I spent a lot of our time thinking about digital credentials. And I think today what we can talk about is what the problem is, how digital credentials can and can't solve that, and then maybe how these credentials might be built. So I know Greg and I have different thoughts on sort of the challenges or the problems of credentials and grades historically. So my favorite problem, the rotten apple, if you will, to me comes from Andrew Carnegie. So you're probably familiar with him, Greg, good friend of the show, railroad baron, but he wanted to basically get people to learn how to work in his factory. And so he said that we're going to make sure that everyone sits in a seat for 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, 20 weeks a year. And that was the Carnegie unit, but no school wanted to adopt it because it was a ridiculous idea. So what he did, which was so ingenious, was said, I will pay the retirement plan of all college professors if you adopt this unit of measurement. And within a year, most of the universities across the United States had in 1906. And I actually got my pension from this fund that Andrew Carnegie set up, which is now TIAA. So if anyone's heard of that, that's actually the foundation of all of the problems in education. And so what we have today in higher education, and then that's trickled down into secondary education as well, is you get credit for sitting in a seat. And that has a lot of problems in my mind. But I know, Greg, you have a lot of thoughts about other problems, not just the Carnegie unit, talking about letter grades and more. So I'd love to hear what you think the problem, the rotten apple, where does it come from in your mind?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I think my focus is more K-12 than higher ed, and there's a lot of crossover in between, but I would put the historical villain, as it were, as Horace Mann, who was the Senate president of Massachusetts. And, not a bad guy, but, the way I understand the story is that we had a much more individualistic form of education. John Dewey being really the founder of progressive constructivist, learning by doing thought. And then you got this Horace Mann guy who comes along who, a noble task, which is let's make it not just for the elite. Let's make it for everyone. Let's make it free, universal, and compulsory, right, for K-12. So he, this was around Civil War time, and he went to then Prussia, Germany, and studied what they were doing, which is they were kind of in this kind of pre-industrial mode of getting people ready for what was becoming the factory system. And so, it's related very much this idea of, okay, we're going to not look for holistic individual development. We're going to start preparing people for the economy. Again, not a terrible idea, but the consequences of which I think we're still living with today in an economy that no longer values just rote following of rules. It now values agency, creativity, empathy. That's how you succeed in the workplace today. Frankly, not pre-calculus, more data science. There's a lot of things that are just really kind of baked into this antiquated notion that we have, and letter grades being first and foremost. We'll come back to those in a second, but what's your thoughts, Scott?
No, I think that's totally true. It leads to something that I love explaining because everyone understands it, which is the sheepskin effect. So it's basically the idea that, if you go to college for 7 semesters and you don't finish the 8th one, you don't get paid 7/8 of a college graduate. And if you go to 11 years of K-12 and you don't finish the 12th year, you don't get paid 11/12 of a high school graduate, right? And we know that we're not learning all of the skills in the last year or the last semester or the last class. And so what employers are paying for is actually the piece of paper, which is ironic based on what you said, because the whole education model is built to prepare people for work, right? But really all we're doing is saying, okay, they can finish stuff, so I'll hire them and I'll train them myself, or I'll help them figure out the skills they need. And so that's a huge problem I see with credentials, is that it's all a way to filter job applicants instead of actually showing skills. So there's some movements away from this with the skills network, with competency-based education, but as a whole, it's not there. So, and I think letter grades are a big part of this kind of sheepskin industrial complex, if you will. Yeah,
totally. I mean, imagine you go to the doctor says, you get a B+. What are you going to do with that? Mm-hmm. Even if you say, okay, you don't just get 1 letter grade, you get 1 per subject. Okay, your lungs are a B+. What do you do with that? How do you act on that? What part of it? What part of my lungs? Why? What do I do? You have no idea. And that's effectively what we're communicating with letter grades. And why is because, we're based on this system of false scarcity. We're based on this notion that there is a bell curve, a distribution of talent, and that the primary role of the education institutions is to sort people in line. Are you in the right side of the curve or the left side of the curve? And that so-called normative distribution is really at the essence of letter grades. We have this idea of, in theory, there's a normative distribution, a bell curve, and traditionally the C was the middle, the A on one side, the F on the other side, and it helped us rank, scale individuals so that they could, get into a scarcity called, increasingly it's associated with the perception of scarcity called college admissions, which, by the way, if you look at the statistics, it's easier to get into college now than it was 30 years ago. But because we have Common App and other things where people apply to 5 times as many colleges, the admissions rate is much lower. So it leads to this feeling of like, oh my God, I've got to get ahead. I've got to get ahead of the other people. It's like the difference between I'm here, at my son's college and he does rock climbing. Now everyone can get to the top or no one can get to the top. Compare that with boxing, right? Where you literally beat the other person to win, right? And that's effectively what we have in this education system, which is my success is fundamentally built on the back of other people. And it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, Scott, when you think about the field that you're in, Web3, right? You could have everyone have those skills or no one have those skills. And it's a little bit like a surgeon where if the surgeon got, a B+, would you want them operating on you? You'd be like, well, wait a second. Was the problem that you didn't know the procedure you were doing with me? Was the where was the problem? I want to know that you have exactly the thing I'm looking for. And when for your job, what you're doing, I talked about a little bit more about what you're doing, because there it's all about the skills. No one cares about the B+. They want to know, what are the skills you've got, right?
Yeah, and in fact, it's almost like the skills become more valuable the more people have them, because then you can collaborate with more people and build more things. And
it's the opposite. Yeah.
And I wonder, Greg, what do you think about this differentiation between what I would call education and learning? So in my mind, learning is you get the skills, education is you get the skills and you get a piece of paper to show you have the skills, right? Like you have a credential showing it. A lot of us learn all the time, watching YouTube videos, going in the backyard, trying to do stuff. But very rarely are we wanting to learn and get the piece of paper. Usually that's in a job context. So why do we need education instead of just learning, or do we?
Well, in your field, right? I mean, talk a little about your field.
Yeah.
Say what your
Yeah,
field
for
is, but I think it's relevant, obviously, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, we're working in helping developers learn Web3, which specifically means coding languages for blockchain for smart contracts. So we teach Rust, we teach Solidity, we teach Cadence, which all help you build contracts and build programs on things like Solana and Ethereum and Flow and others. And so in this case, we need a variety of technical talent, right? People who can do the hard coding, people who can do UI, people who can do data analysis on chain. And there's a huge shortage of talent. And that's why employers use services like ours to find the talent. So we basically make our money from employers who are trying to find the talent, and the education is essentially free, right? Like our students pay $100 and they get $200 back. So they're actually incentivized to finish and they end up ahead. And because the problem is not, is Scott or Greg going to get the job? The problem is I have 10 more jobs open. Like who else is going to come and help, So I think that happens in a lot of emerging fields, right? Because whether it's Web3 development or AI or machine learning or, maybe it's data science, whatever, like it moves too fast for traditional education. And also we don't have 2 years or 4 years to train people, right? We need them now. We can't wait for a master's degree or a bachelor's degree or associates or whatever it might be. So that's only going to speed up, like there's only more things coming. And so I think we need alternative ways to get those either learnings or education, depending on what employers and students think they need.
Yeah, and you literally have the opposite of false scarcity. You've got network effect. If everyone in the world understood how to use smart contracts, there'd be a much bigger Web3 economy.
Yeah, there'd
right?
be more
and
jobs. Yep.
There'd be more jobs, right? So the more people who have these skills, the better it is for the people who have those skills, as opposed to the boxing thing where you have to beat the other person in order to get ahead.
Yeah. So let me throw a challenge at you then. So why do we have this thing called the Matthew effect? So I know it's Sunday morning here. I know you're in Massachusetts, so probably not a church-going state, right? All those the people who fled religion. But I'm sure you'll remember Matthew 25:29. For to all of those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But for those who have nothing, even what they have will be taken away. True biblical brimstone and fire. But what we see in EdTech, as people come into education, they bring new solutions, but what we see is the gap actually increases, right? Those who are already getting a good education, learn more and learn faster. Those who are behind actually fall further behind. So this is known as the Matthew effect, which is essentially the people who are doing well do better the more we try to intercede, and the people who are doing worse actually do worse the more we try to bring technology. So why is that, and how is Web3 or maybe alternative credentials going to stop that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's a big mistake to blame education, the schools, for that divide. And there's a lot that you read it in the literature all the time about how schools are failing kids. Well, that is not true. What's failing folks is the economy. What's failing folks is the lack of intergenerational wealth among people of color that has led to a segmentation of economic opportunity. What the reason why that is because in your home, there will be 3 million more words spoken to your children by the time they get to school. By the time they get to school, you will have read 1,000 books to each of your children as they go to bed at night. The advantage that bestows upon your kids compared to kids who are growing up in poverty and scarcity is immense. And it's like you're starting a race, except for some kids start way, way, way ahead. Right. And it just compounds, right? Because by the time you get to 3rd grade, those who are not able to read effectively by 3rd grade don't access the next segment of schools. And then it sort of manifests itself into, it sort of makes sense when you think about reading and writing, but then it manifests itself into this other selection called 8th grade algebra, and which, makes some sense. Algebra is very much a general skill that people need to have in terms of understanding abstraction. Algebra 2, pre-calculus, trigonomics, quadratic equation, calculus. My mom was a calculus teacher. Got to say, it's important for certain engineering professions. It's totally irrelevant for the rest of us. Used as a hazing system now to further separate the haves from the have-nots.
It's the Chem 101 of high school.
Right. And it's used to just, so that's where I think we really need to rethink things, right? Which is we do got to get everyone to reading and writing and speaking with proficiency and confidence across argumentative, narrative, and creative, domains. We do need people to be able to have basic algebraic thinking, the ability to take a problem and break it into smaller problems and think logically about path. And that's the same thing with recipes and cooking and carpentry as it is for algebra. And there's some common things that you need about ratios, as a really kind of a core concept. Beyond that, what we need much more data science. We need everyone to really understand how to be able to use a spreadsheet. You really need to understand ratios and kind of basic relationships between numbers, and large amounts of numbers and large amounts of data. So we're focused on this other thing, which is this totally antiquated system of higher ed. Do you know, Scott, what % of Americans who start post-secondary finish?
60%?
It's about half.
About half? Yeah.
It's about half. Right. So for half of Americans, they get debt, no diploma, just like you said. And there's no acknowledgement, really. In fact, you're sort of looked at as a failure compared to someone who never even started in the first place.
Yeah.
So I've got this kid who I'm mentoring. I don't know what, in your community, what folks are like. I live in a city with a lot of immigrant kids. And it's just not clear to me that starting the college process always makes sense, to encourage every kid to start college if they won't have necessarily the means to complete, as opposed to really getting into solid apprenticeships and work-based learning. What do you see in your community? And your kids are younger.
Yeah, my kids are younger. I think the challenge I have is there's all these alternative learning opportunities, but how do we get them to count, right? And I think that's maybe a tie into a lot of the work that you and I think about is what does a personal credential look like, or what does a learner record look like? So I think what excites me is the idea that blockchain technology could actually enable us to keep track of things. I always think the blockchain, people call it a ledger. I don't think many of us remember ledgers. Like I remember going to the local meat shop, and I would just pick up anything and then they would write down, and then my mom would come in and pay for whatever I had taken, at the end of the week. But most of us probably don't remember those things because I'm getting old. So to me, it's like a Google spreadsheet, right? It just keeps tracks of the things I've done, and we can say who has told us that Scott's good at this thing. And if we can truly unlock that credential, then all of these alternative learning experiences make so much sense. But the challenge is when people don't recognize them, it feels sort of like a waste of time to a lot of people, I think, to say, yeah, I'd like to do that, but it's not going to give me a better job. It's not going to give me scholarship. It's not going to do this or that, maybe if I stay in that track, I can move up. But curious about pushback on something like that. Do you think we have to solve the credential recognition problem first, or will it solve itself with the demand potentially?
Let me share a slide, because this is something you and I are working on together, and just kind of put it out there, because that's part of what we're here to talk about, really, is this idea of the Internet of Education, of Education 3.0, of learning and employment records, verifiable learning and employment records. This vision of the near future in which people's skills become machine readable data that can be held and controlled from a digital wallet app and exchanged like currency for learning and employment opportunities on the open internet, the way goods and services are exchanged today, right? So that's what we're working on, right? And it's interesting because we're part of this community, 3D is, and a lot of the folks here are part of this community that see this vision. And as Taylor Kendall said, once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? Once you see how much better that would be for everyone. We've spent a lot of time trying to explain how the Internet of Education works, right? This picture, right, which we're working so hard on, and we try to explain it over and over again. And we've got animations and we've got cartoons and we've got all these different ways to explain how this is going to work. But what I've found, and when we did these workshops on trying to figure out how to explain this story better, is the best way to explain it is to say, do you know a young person that you love? Could be your own child, could be a niece or nephew, someone who you care about, who is involved in the learning process, this main process. And how do you think it's fulfilling their potential? And what would it be like if you had a system that was able to really recognize, acknowledge, support all of the specific evidence of mastery that they have, and then help them to find what's next? what is next on their personal journey, their pathway
Mhm.
to whatever goals they may have. And they may be specific. You might get some kid who wants to be a doctor and they really need to get calculus and get organic chemistry and all of that stuff. Otherwise, they are not going to become a doctor. And then other people who are more broad about, they like music, they like sports, they don't really know what they want to do in the world, and there's certain skills that are going to be helping them. So when you tell it that way and you start thinking about the young person in my life, what would I want from them? Would I want them to be characterized by letter grades that provide no diagnostic information and don't help them to figure out what's next? Or would I want them to have this rich set of privately held data on their digital wallet application so that when they're, if the kid has a paper route, when they're in middle school and they earn a little bit of money, and then they go to high school and they earn a little bit more and they go to college, they've got a college job, and then they, workplace, they get their first job and they get all that money. It's all going from different sources into one bank account. And then they go to Mexico and they exchange it for a vacation in Mexico in pesos. What if we could do the same thing with their skills? What if we could really acknowledge what that kid learned during the period that they had a paper route, with the specific skills of self-advocacy, of like being on time? Like this kid had a 99% paper route delivery, success in terms of, getting papers there on time. That's actually worth something in the workplace. People would want to know that compared to some other kid who wasn't able to do that. And all of their skills in high school, both academic, Carnegie, non-Carnegie, all of the different things that they can learn, and then into college and into the workplace. And then they go to some jurisdiction that doesn't even speak the same language as them, that has an idea of jobs that is expressed in a different language with a different set of, the job description, but that you can automatically express your skills in a way that is machine readable, understandable in Mexico. And this is really what, this is what we're working on together, right? Which is this idea of what does it mean to program or pre-program the credential so that when you say there's a digital badge, a credential, a micro credential, that thing is not just a data blob. It's a thing that has meaning in a set of logic that is expressed in a way that is common, so that you can express what that kid learned in the paper in the college and other thing in a way that the job application in Mexico that a system can automatically interpret their job skills in a way that crosswalks to the experiences that the young person had in their paper route, et cetera.
Yeah. So why don't you stop your screen share? I'll do one last one. We'll kind of bring it home with some examples, because to me, the three really powerful pieces here are that you can own your own credential. And that would mean that anything you learn, regardless of whether it's in school or elsewhere, will count. Secondly, that your credential will actually talk back to you, right? It'll unlock opportunities or pathways. Like if you go get this other thing, you're going to be qualified for this. And then I think third is that since it's machine readable, it allows employers to actually find people that aren't in their immediate network, which, if you're doing it right, will really diversify talent, because we typically hire people we know, people who know people. And so we end up, just hiring people like us. So here's how I think about it, Greg. I know you got your triangle. I'll kind of show you. Here's how I think about it in action, and then a few examples. So, you get a skill, and then you put that in your digital wallet or your learner record or your backpack or whatever, and it's validated, right? It's verified. And then your wallet shows you, here's the other skills you might need to become something, right? So you get these skills and they're all validated. And now I'm a blockchain developer. Like I've done the things needed to be a job. Now an employer can look at that, right? And they can validate that I did the thing. And then they can actually validate as well, like what are the skills that went into that job title, right? I got the master's degree or the bachelor's degree in blockchain, if it might be. But then they can do the same thing across anyone else who chooses to share that information. So now they're finding new people. And then maybe it's too many candidates, right? So they add in, you also need design skills and you also need some finance, right? And so it starts filtering out candidates. So all of a sudden they might find someone they didn't know that lives in a country they've never heard of, that went to a school they don't trust, but they have the skills they need, right? And so a couple examples at MetaCrafters, we've built this for employers. This is our employer platform. And essentially anyone can come in and test their blockchain skills and get a credential from us that then puts them into the talent pool, right? And then employers can say, we need people who have Web3.js or JavaScript or backend, and based on that, they can find candidates, right? And these candidates, if they don't have the skills, they can take the class from us, or they can just, maybe they're autodidacts, or they watched YouTube, or they went to something else and get it. And I also think like this is probably too specific, but this is essentially what we're talking about. It's just a little bit of data, and you don't even have to be a coder to understand it, right? Where it's like the name is a bachelor's degree, it doesn't have to be too complicated. One of my other favorite examples, and I'll kick it back to you for the third one, because I know you know more about it. But Migrants is an interesting example, I think, in Italy, where they're actually finding in-demand jobs and then helping train asylum seekers even before they come to Italy, so that they're prepared for these jobs when they get there. And 86% of the people who've been placed in jobs through this are still in the job 6 months later. So they're finding, necessary jobs, connecting with people and giving them the training they need and then connecting it. And then I think the third one you can speak to, Greg, is what's going on in North Dakota, which is actually like mapping this entire thing in a traditional world. So this is from something you work a lot with, which you can talk a little bit about, Case, and then we'll kind of wrap.
Yeah, so, we 2015, we started this process of understanding how do you encode ontologies. Well, what's ontology? An ontology could be like math. It's just a body of knowledge, right? How would you look at all of math and think about it? There is no common Dewey Decimal System, right? And so each state has its own academic standards. There was this movement to the Common Core that has been, drifting apart. And even more so, colleges have their own sui generis system of course objectives and things that make it difficult to equate. So we created a technical standard called CASE and a open source piece of software called OpenSalt, and which is what you're seeing right here. And it's a way of just encoding some very simple logic about how each skill statement relates to other skills. So we've been using that in North Dakota first to encode and then to publish as blockchain verifiable credentials every high school transcript. And now we're taking it outside of the traditional academic mode with the North Dakota Department of Technology and Instruction to look at job pathways like cybersecurity. And so we're looking at the K-12 curriculum, the community college courses, the work-based skills that are needed, and mapping that all into this common pathway that you can then talk about how each learner's evidence of mastery of a node on that pathway advances them. So I know we're going to end. Can I just show one last slide as we go?
Yeah, and I think if you can, while you're doing that, give people like what's the next step, because a lot of this is systems change, right? It's really hard. So as an individual watching this, I think it's good to give them a few ideas of how to move forward.
Well, look, there's a lot of evidence of fantastic things happening in education. There are teachers all across the country and the world who are doing incredible things with kids. What there isn't is much evidence of scale. What we're doing is we see individual acts of amazing educators in a system that is fundamentally built against their work. So, this quote from John Dewey, who we started with, what the best and wisest parent wants for his own child, that must the community want for all of its children. Any other ideal for our schools is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. We think about that today, right? And so how do you get involved? Should folks get involved? I think Reedy and the Ed3 community is really the way to get involved. There's a lot of very technical work being done, and we have ways to connect people into that certainly through our technical standards that we're working on things. But the DAO and the community that Reedy's building is a way to extend that from technology into policy. Reedy?
Amazing. What an amazing segue. Thank you for that. I don't know if you had planned that, but it was perfect. Thank you guys for an awesome talk. It was super engaging. I learned a lot, and I really want to dive deeper into everything that you're talking about. So let's just keep this going for 2 more hours. Just kidding. Thank you again, Greg and Scott. As usual, super interesting. You guys always talk about, the future of education and the future of learning in ways that are really novel and really practical. It just changes the way that you think about things, even if you thought about them before. I don't know if that makes sense, but thank you again. So we're going to close out our Ed Talks for this morning. Do you guys have any last words before we talk about what's coming next in the schedule?
Thanks for letting us participate.
Yeah, I would
Yeah.
just say Greg runs a community that's totally open to join ed3.0. And I have a podcast and blog ed3.gg. And both of those are places where we love feedback and communication. I think both of us are really open to having new participants. So don't just listen, like join the conversation is what I would say.
Definitely. Awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're all a happy Ed3 community.
Yep.
Well, thank you guys for being here. Next up, we've got a 15-minute break. Take a break either in the Ed3verse or IRL, and then we'll have 10 learning labs coming up. So thank you guys again, and we'll see you in the environment.